are glad and thankful for those that may have logged on to the church's website or to the YouTube channel or the Facebook page. And again, want to remind those that are familiar with the church's website, eastalbertville.org, there is a place that you can click and download the outline for the study tonight. And that's what we try to do with each and every Wednesday evening study, is to have an outline that you can use to follow along with us, or at least have something that you can maybe study at some future time. So thankful for the website and for Shane's upkeep of it and for the availability of the outline. So good to have each and every one. Our study tonight is, of course, continuing and looking at lessons that we can learn from characters that we read about in the Old Testament. And tonight's lesson, we're going to be dealing with Lot. And of course, reminding ourselves that the things, whatsoever things were written before, were written for our learning, that we, through patience and comfort of the scriptures, might have hope. So we want to look at his life, the things that we find recorded in the scriptures, and see what lessons it is that we could truly benefit from. According to Genesis 11 and verse 27, Lot is Abraham's brother's son. So that would make Lot Abraham's nephew. We see that he is the son of Haran, and Haran and Terah were brothers, and Terah was Abraham's father. So Lot is uh, Abraham's nephew. Abraham is Lot's uncle. We see that after God told Abraham to leave his family and his father's house to go into the land of Canaan, that he went out taking with him his nephew Lot and also his wife, Abraham's wife, Sarah. Let's read verses 1, 4, and 5 of Genesis chapter 12. Brother Mike.
Now the Lord had said to Abram, get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. So Abraham departed as the Lord had spoken, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Then Abram took Sarah his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people whom they had acquired in Haran. They departed to go to the land of Canaan. So they came to the land of Canaan.
All right, so Abraham took Sarah, his wife, Lot, his brother's son, and all of their possessions, and they go to the land of Canaan. It's in Genesis 13 that it tells us that Abraham and Lot's possessions grew in number, so much so that the land that they were currently on was just simply not able to support the herds of both of these individuals that we read in the first 12 verses of Genesis 13. And so we see that from verse 7, the herdsmen even fought against each other. And it's in verse 9 that it was because of all of this that Abraham decided to part ways. That would be the best. That would be for the benefit of both of them, for them to part ways. And this is the beginning of Lot's problems. We know that first off, Lot chose the place that he thought would be good for his herd, but he didn't know that it wasn't good for him. In Genesis 13, verses 10 through 13, Rodney, read that for us.
And Lot lifted his eyes and saw all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere, before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt as you go toward Zoar. Then Lot chose for himself all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated from each other. Abraham dwelt in the land of Canaan, And Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain, pitched his tent, even as far as Sodom. But men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord.
So that's where we see that it begins. The next thing is that Lot and his family become what you would call spoils of war and needed Abraham to rescue them, which Abraham does. 4 kings came up against the kings of Sodom, Gomorrah, and other cities, and they engaged in battle. Well, the battle wasn't going the way of Sodom and Gomorrah, so that means it was not going well for Lot because they end up being a possession of the kings that invaded. In fact, they conquered all of what Sodom and Gomorrah had. So when Abraham learned of this, that Lot had been taken captive, he grouped his men together and went up and battled against the kings, rescued Lot, and brought back all of the things that the kings had captured. And so restored Lot along with the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. So we see here that Lot certainly fell on dangerous ground, very dangerous territory, being captive in this war that took place in Genesis 14. And we see, as we read, the actions of the wicked people in the place that Lot chose vexed him. We read that in 2 Peter 2, verse 7, Ruben.
Deliver just Lot vexed with the filthy conversation of the wicked.
That is the rendering of the King James, that they delivered Lot, who was vexed with the filthy conversation of the wicked. If you look at some other translations, you'll see different wordings on that word vexed, such as greatly troubled Lot. It distressed Lot. It made Lot miserable. And in fact, even one translation said it wore down. So these are some of the things that we can hopefully help to get the understanding of what the word vexed means. Another thing that shows that his choosing was the beginning of his problems is he lost his wife, because we know she disobeyed God while they were leaving the city. And that's recorded in Genesis 19, verses 12 through 26. If there's anything that we at all remember of Lot, or if we hear Lot's name, generally the first thing that we will recall is that Lot's wife looked back. And that's why I've been in places in the church buildings where the clock in the back of the room, they have a little sign underneath it that says, remember Lot's wife. So you don't look back at the clock. But anyway, that is probably the most familiar thing that we recall when we think about Lot. But then too, last of all, his own daughters, having no sense of morality, in that they caused him to get drunk so that they could bear his children. And that we read in Genesis 19, verses 30 through 18. So that gives us just a concise, general summary of Lot and what we find recorded here in Genesis from about chapter 11 through chapter 19. So what are some lessons? I believe truly one lesson is that your direction, not your intention, determines your destiny. No doubt, at every single step leading up to disaster, Lot would have told you what his intention was. He would have no doubt said things like, well, I'm going to honor the God of Abraham. I'm not going to get caught up in all of the nonsense and the sin of Sodom. That could very well have been his intentions. But it's not our intention that determines our destination. It's our direction. For some, the direction that they're heading, they're going to wreck their lives. They are on a path that will lead to addiction, possibly. Or they are on a direct path to divorce. Well, they don't intend to do it. No one intends to wreck their lives. But it's the direction, not the intention, that matters. The moment that Lot pitched his tent towards Sodom, he started walking down that path that led him to running for his life with everything around him being destroyed. Possessions and herds separated Lot from his uncle, Abraham. And so oftentimes, and let it not be, that money and riches would ever be over and beyond our family. Another lesson is what we set our eyes on is what we begin to value. Let's recall where it was that Lot determined his direction. It was when Abraham gave him the choice of where to live. In Genesis 13, verse 10, Jeremy, read that for us.
And Lot lifted his eyes and saw all the plain of Jordan, and it was well watered everywhere before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as you go towards Jordan.
Now, we read that verse a moment ago, but I want to be sure that we read it again. Because what we're seeing here is that Lot couldn't get past what his eyes saw. Because what he set his eyes on is what he began to value. And this is the complete opposite with Abraham. Abraham didn't go by what he saw. And we see that in Hebrews 11, verse 8, Brother Glenn.
By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called up to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going.
So Abraham, we can see in all of this, truly walked by faith, whereas Lot walked by sight. And I think we all know what 2 Corinthians 5, verse 7 says, doesn't it? For we walk by faith and not by sight. It's an extremely dangerous thing to live by sight because the eyes are so deceiving. No doubt once Lot saw the plain of Jordan, he couldn't get his mind off of it. Isn't that the way it works? Something that is appealing to us, we just can't seem to think any other thing, think any other thoughts. So what are we choosing to put in front of our eyes? Is it God's word? Or is it the television? Is it God's word? Or is it a phone? You see, whatever we put in front of our eyes, be it for better or for worse, that's what we begin to value. So that's why it's so important that we be so very careful. Don't dwell on, don't meditate on wickedness and don't allow wicked people to influence us. Lot pitched his tent even as far as Sodom, which was a place where Rodney read just a moment ago, the people lived exceedingly wicked and sinful. And the other statement was this was all against the Lord, the way these people were living. Lot constantly exposed himself to wickedness, to sinfulness. And we're warned not to do that. In Matthew 6, verses 22 and 23, Brother Donnie, read that for us.
The lamp of the body is the eye. If therefore your eye is good, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If therefore the light that is in you is dark, how great is that darkness?
That's a verse we would all do well to remember. Sometimes I've heard it put that the eyes are the windows of the soul. And I think that's true. Because our eyes are that with which we are impressed, either good or bad. Our eyes are a very fundamental part of our physical senses. So truly, what we set our eyes on is what we begin to value. To lesson 3, sin always has our best interest at heart. Excuse me, I want you to understand that I'm using that best interest sort of sarcastically. But I think it is a point that can be made. You know, Lot, no doubt, felt fully justified making that decision to pitch his tents towards Sodom. Don't you think he did? Sure he did. It was a plain, that means it was a level ground, and that would certainly be much better for his flocks than the hill country that they were so used to. There was civilization, I'll get it in a minute, in the plains. And think about what that would be. Think about the advantage of that, of being able either to take your produce to market or else just to go to the market. Think of the convenience. So in his mind, he probably had a number of reasons to justify as to why that his choice was the right choice. But that's the problem. You see, sin always has our best interest at heart. And I think truly that we've lived this truth out in our lives far too many times. If we have any age on us at all, I think we can relate to having lived this thing out. We've managed to talk ourselves into every bad decision that we've ever made. We talked ourselves into it. And every bad decision that we've ever made in our life has had one common denominator: me, myself, and I. Sin is so deceiving. And that's the very reason why we need God and His Word. Because if we're left on our own, we will deceive ourselves into every bad decision that we'll ever make, and we'll justify those bad decisions every step of the way as being in our best interest. So sin always has our best interest at heart, or at least that's what we think when we're on our own doing the thinking. Another lesson is to value God's mercy and run away from what he wants us to run away from. In Genesis 19, we see how God rescued Lot and his family. God did not want Lot to stay in Sodom. And so he sent his angels to bring Lot, his wife, his 2 daughters out before he would destroy the cities. But Lot and his family, however, for some reason, strangely lingered. Read for us Genesis 19, verses 15 and 16, Brother Rex.
In the morning, the angels urged Lot to hurry, say, "Arise, take your wife and your 2 daughters whom are here, lest you be consumed in the punishment of the city." And while he lingered, the men took hold of his hand, his wife's hand, and hands of his 2 daughters, the Lord being merciful to him. And they brought him out and set him outside the city.
Now notice that the angels urged Lot to hurry. They urged Lot to hurry. But then look what it says. It says that while he lingered. And then in the end of it all, look what had to happen. The angels took hold of his hand, his wife's hand, and the hand of his 2 daughters and brought them out of the city. God was merciful to Lot, even though he and his family apparently didn't really value for what it was worth. You know, it could have been that Lot's wife didn't really want to leave. After all, we know that though God gave instructions not to look back, that's the very thing that she did. Well, why did she look back? Well, we all know what the possibilities were that would have maybe made her to look back. A longing. You know, we're not really sure as to exactly how many years, but you know, it don't take a whole lot of years to get comfortable, get used to a place. Diane and I stayed in Mike and Gwen's house for 1.5 years, and we got awful comfortable. In fact, it was a little sad when we had to leave. So no, it don't take an incredible amount of time, but I would think we're probably looking at a number of years. So we can see an attachment, obviously. But whether that was the case or not, we don't know. But they did linger. And it seemed as if they were having to be more than just a little urged to leave. It wasn't something that they seemed to be gladly doing and something that they were seeing the urgency to leave.
Brother Young,
Yes.
she still had sons and all her daughters in the city also.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And of course, we know what happened when Lot's wife looked back. Lot loses his wife. Why this is so important to bring up about Lot is to make the application for you and me. Today, we need to give value to what God has done for us through his Son, Jesus Christ. Christ gave his own life for us. And because he was the only one who could free us from sin. sin and death. It was the only means of escape. It is the only means of escape. It will always be the only means of escape from sin and death. So we must learn to value that and ourselves never look back to the sin of which we have been delivered from. So what about us? What about us, and what about some bad situations that we might be in? Maybe it's a work situation where ethics left the building a long time ago. Maybe that's the situation that we're in. Excuse me. Maybe you're single and you're in a sexual relationship you know that God doesn't honor. Or maybe you're involved in a habit that you thought you could control, but now it's controlling you. See, whatever the case, if you're ever living in Sodom, if you're ever living in a situation where you know is wrong, run. Lot justified, Lot rationalized his decision to live in Sodom for years. But in the end, he had to run. So let's value God's mercy. And let's run away from the things that he wants us to run away from. And then the fifth lesson, as bad as things were, see, our choices directly affect those we love and the generations after us. See, as bad as things were for Lot, his story isn't finished. The rest of it is found in Genesis 19, verses 30 through 38. It's not a pretty story, but it needs to be read. And I hope if you're in the habit of reading maybe the Bible, a few verses before you turn in tonight, read those verses. Genesis 19, verses 30 through 38. You see, after Lot had lost all that he had, he'd lost his home, he lost his wife. Lot and his two daughters are fleeing to the mountains, and they live in a cave. These same two daughters that he had remembered earlier, when the angels first came to his house, he offered his two daughters to the mob that was outside of his door. But these same two daughters thought up the idea for them to, as verse 32 in Genesis 19 says, preserve the lineage of our father. They got Lot drunk, and they carried out their plan. You know, it's interesting to note that the descendants of that incest that we're reading about in these verses, the descendants became tribes, nations of people that would be at war with the children of Israel for generations, for centuries. How many times do you read in the Old Testament concerning the Moabites, the Ammonites? Those are the two nations that are the result of what these two daughters did. So, Lot's choices that he made in life, let us understand, that just didn't affect him. They just didn't affect him, and neither do our choices affect just us. They got his wife killed. It ruined the lives of his two daughters and his sons, his grandsons, and their descendants for generations. So see, let this point sink in well. Our choices never just affect us. They always affect others. They always affect those that we love and the generations to come. Our choices never just affect us. And yet I think that's sometimes the very thing that is thought and sometimes the very thing that is said to justify certain actions that some individuals want to do. Well, it's just me. No, it's never. It's never just you. So, in our conclusion, may we learn from Lot to not be moved by the appearance of things. Let us learn to choose wisely. Let us learn to walk in honor. And let us learn to listen to the Lord. I think that these, as well as the ones that we've looked in detail, are lessons that we truly need to come away with when we study about the life of Lot. 1 minute. All right? Lord willing, next Wednesday night, we want to do a study of Melchizedek. Now, Melchizedek's going to be a little bit different. We don't have a whole lot about him and things he did, but he is put into a context of where there is much that we need to learn. Because Melchizedek, for what few verses that we read about in Genesis 14, the bulk of what we learn and what we know about Melchizedek is found in the New Testament. So it's more of a study of learning the role, the relationship of the priesthood of Melchizedek and how that brought about and how that compares with the priesthood of our Lord. So, and I know some of these characters that we studied, well, you know, we haven't, after we left Adam and Eve, we hadn't got away from Abraham now for the past, 3 studies, and we're not going to get away really from Abraham all that much with Melchizedek, because Melchizedek is a character in the life of Abraham. But what I want us to do is that because of these other studies, especially Abraham, it would be a very difficult task to ask you to read all of the verses. I hope that I want to encourage you concerning Melchizedek. I want you to read Genesis 14. That's where we're first introduced to him. And we see the setting, the context that is taking place that brings Melchizedek into the picture. But then I want you to read Hebrews chapter 7, because almost that entire 7th chapter is a lot of things that we need to understand and make sure that we know concerning Melchizedek. There are other passages in Hebrews chapter 5, Hebrews chapter 6, but there's just but a few verses in those. So if you don't read the Bible, let this be an opportunity between now and next Wednesday night to do so. And if you do read, then I would urge you to let these two chapters be a part of what you read between now and then, because it's going to be impossible, especially Hebrews 7, for us to spend the time to look at or even to read that whole chapter, but just to make sure that we go into it and get the things that are so needful for us to understand. So, a little homework before next Wednesday evening. So thank you so much for your attention and for being able to study together. Thank you.